So now we're going to actually start painting our color wheel. So as you can see here, I have a primary red. So this red is actually going to act a little bit more like a magenta. A primary blue, again in quotes. It's going to act a little bit more like a cyan, just a regular yellow, a black, and a white. Depending on what kind of paint you got, your set might also come with a green. We will not be using that. So you're just going to set this to the side and kind of pretend it doesn't exist. So for painting our color wheel, I like to recommend starting with the primary colors. So I've actually taped mine off. You don't have to do that, but some people think that it is helpful. That isn't necessarily going to stop paint from getting underneath the tape and kind of causing those issues, but sometimes I tape it off, sometimes I don't. It just kind of depends on how I'm feeling that day. It makes some things a little bit faster, but you know, paint can definitely get under the edges, which can be a little bit of a nightmare in its own way. So I'm just kind of taping off the last primary right there. If you are going to tape it off, I always say kind of run your finger along the edge where the paint's going to be. There's less likely of a chance of your paint kind of leaking through the bottom. So I'm going to start with our red, or our primary red, which is going to act a little bit like a magenta. So I'm just going to get out a little bit of my red, and I'm going to dip my paintbrush in water. And I'm just going to pull out a little bit of the paint. So we're thinning it down just to make it a little bit easier to move around, but we don't want to thin it out so much and make it watery. And if your paints are new, there might be some binder at the top of it, kind of like a watery material. Just kind of mix that in. Nothing's wrong with your paint. It's kind of normal for it to separate. So this is going to go tint, hue, tone, shade. So tint, hue, tone, shade. So we're going to do the hue first. So a hue is a color in its purest form. Nothing has been changed about it. No, its value hasn't been changed. And I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but on mine I can kind of still see the white of the paper through the paint. That means I'm probably going to have to do a second layer, which is very normal, doing a second, sometimes even a third layer, depending on what kind of paints, what brand of paints you have. It's a very normal thing to need to do. All right, just gonna let that dry. Kind of wash off my paintbrush. And I like to have a rag that I just kind of mush it out on. I like to have kind of dirty water and like less dirty water. So I'll kind of do the bulk of my washing in this one and then kind of rinse it off in this one. So let's go ahead, while this is drying, let's go ahead and talk about our tint, tone, and shade. So a tint is any color, so any hue. So remember, hue is color. So tint is hue plus white. I remember because white has an I in it, just like tint. Color in pure form. So tone is going to be hue plus gray. I don't have a fancy way to remember that one. Shade is going to be hue plus black. And I just remember that black is dark, just like the shade is dark. So that's my clever way to kind of remember all those. So this is how we're going to actually paint our little pie slices. So you're going to have tint in the outer ring, our hue, our tone, and our shade. So let's go ahead and make a tint of red. So I'm just gonna get a little bit of white out on my palette. And we're going to mix just a little bit of our color into our white. So again, I like to have a little bit of paint. I'm gonna pull a little bit of white out to the side. This is just gonna make it so that if I need to add more white, I'm not actually having to add more from my, my tube. I can actually add more from this little pile. So the analogy I use is a fairy sized teacup. So, you know, you've filled a fairy's teacup, and that's about how much paint we're gonna actually need to make our tint. So how much color do you need to add for your tint? That's really up to you. Some people like to do really, really light tints. Some people like to do less light tints. That's going to be a preference for each artist, but you want it to be relatively consistent. So you want to add about the same amount of white into each one, but keep in mind white is going to affect certain hues differently. So to make it consistent, you might need to add more or less white to different hues. So just kind of keep that in mind. And then don't be afraid to move your paper around to kind of turn it in circles to kind of get a better angle, or even kind of turning your brush in different directions. Try the different types of brushes. So this is an angled flat. I think it's really good for getting nice straight edges. So just try the different ones and see which one is working best for you. So let's go on to the shade. So we're going to do the shade right here on the inner part because it kind of goes from light to dark. The shade can be a little tricky because black affects, you know, all colors differently. And it's really easy for black to kind of take over whatever color you are making. So you want to add enough black into your hue so that it changes it, but you still want to be able to tell what hue you started off with, if that makes sense. So what we don't want is to just have like a ring of black around here. So if we add too much black to all our hues, it's just going to look like a ring of black. We want it to look like we're getting that kind of prismatic rainbow effect as we're going around the color wheel. And I'm going to grab just the tiniest bit of black. I like to have a scratch piece of paper sitting around so I can kind of test the colors. So that looks pretty good actually. I thought it was actually too dark, but I'm kind of happy with that. It definitely still looks like a primary red, but it has changed, so it looks like a shade. So I think that this is actually pretty good. I might need to make more of it though. So since I made more of it, I just want to go ahead and test it. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. And so this is going on the inner ring. So resist the urge. If you find yourself running out of paint, resist the urge to just add water, because all you're going to do is thin it out and you'll be able to see the paper underneath. It won't be flat and opaque. It won't be pretty. So just remake the color. You will have to remake colors so much in your life as an artist. It's really good practice. So now we're going to go on to our tone. So we have tint, hue, tone, shade. So we're going to do our tone right here. which is hue plus gray. So what I like to do is I like to actually make the gray first. We do that because we want to make sure we are making the same gray all the way around the color wheel. So what's really nice about using wax paper or palette paper is you see how the paint doesn't like to absorb into the wax paper. That's going to keep my paint from drying out as fast. Now, if you don't have wax paper or palette paper, you definitely could just use a scratch piece of paper. That's totally fine, but it does last a little bit longer if you have it on something like wax paper, or even if you have like an old ceramic plate that you're not using. Just to keep in mind, anything that you put paint on, you shouldn't eat on afterwards. You would think I wouldn't have to say these things, but I do. So as far as the gray that you make, it should be a mid gray. And then now I'm going to grab some of my red and mix it in. Red and gray make this kind of almost mauve color. And the colors on the screen aren't nearly as bright as they are in real life. So just kind of keep that in mind. I'm getting some really beautiful colors and I look up at the screen and they look a little flat. So I'll try to take a nice picture of this too and put it online for you guys to see. Okay. So I'm pretty happy with that. We're actually going to paint this inner triangle. These kind of diamond shapes are going to get painted red, yellow, and blue to kind of correspond with their pie slices. So I didn't tape off this shape, so I'm going to actually just kind of show you guys a little bit on how to do straight edges. What I like to do is I like to kind of get a little bead of paint, kind of almost like a little pool of paint right on the edge of my paintbrush. And then I just kind of drag it along the straight edge. Perfect. So you're going to go ahead and do that for every single pie slice on here. So you're going to have it for red, yellow, and then your blue, and then for all your secondaries and your tertiaries. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of quickly do the primaries, and then I'll go on to our secondaries and our tertiaries. And since I'm moving on to another color, I actually just went ahead and changed my water. Change water frequently. It's how you're going to kind of keep your colors from getting muddy. And make sure you're washing your paintbrushes out really well too. So what I was saying before was that yellow and black actually kind of make a green. So you guys can kind of see here, that's yellow and black. It actually goes quite green, which I've always thought was kind of fun. The colors are actually going to dry a slightly different color than they look like they are when they're wet, and you kind of just have to get used to that and adjust for that. So colors tend to dry a little bit darker. Now that's a generalization that can definitely change depending on colors and brands and other things, but I find they tend to dry a little bit darker. Okay, pretty happy with that. And remember, we're going to do this kind of diamond shape in the middle. Okay, pretty happy with that. So I'm going to go ahead and do the blue on my own. I'm going to meet you guys back for the secondaries and the tertiaries.